This tiny golden aura is the grace of the Erd Tree. This light once shone in the eyes of your tarnished brethren, but now it is all that guides you. Or so I hear. You can see them, can't you? The rays of grace that guide you through your burden. Upon the cliff in Castle Stormvale is a shard-bearer, a demigod, who inherited a fragment of the shattered Elden Ring. If the rays of grace signal the castle, then the Elden Ring beckons you. As an ally by pact, I pray that you are fit to face the challenge presented by the ring.
Oh man, Elden Ring. A game with so much to talk about for better and worse. From Software have hit the market with another lightning strike in the bottle here. Ever since Dark Souls 1, they took the bones of Demon Souls and scored gold with it, which would lead them to the path of being one of the most praised and cult-ridden studios out there today. They are currently one of my favourite studios for simply making challenging but fun games that are rewarding and satisfying. And each of their recent games have something different to offer. The Souls games and Elden Ring have the build variety that encourages multiple playthroughs. Bloodborne has aggressive but equally rewarding combat in a really fucking cool setting. Sekiro and Armored Core 6 offer experiences off the beaten path that have fantastic combat, even though they develop their own formula. Elden Ring, though, has been their most successful game as of late, even to the point of winning Game of the Year. From Software had many flowers given to them over the years with consistent releases, but Elden Ring has received the biggest flowers out of the bunch. Just like before with the earlier Dark Souls games, Elden Ring is inviting more and more people over to its type of gameplay. Even people that don't normally play Souls games have been for the most part enjoying it and having fun. But as someone who's been playing the Souls games since 2013 and has seen the games evolve over the years, I'm left now raising more questions than I did before. And opening my horizons towards other games with different combat systems is now making me ask what more could be added to the experience. I love Elden Ring. I genuinely think it's the best game they've done since Bloodborne. Its highs are incredibly high. The sense of awe and discovery was back, something I hadn't felt in the From Software games since the first Dark Souls, and its combat is even more refined than Dark Souls 3. It also has its lows, and all of the From Software games have their lows. But the lows in Elden Ring are the kind of lows that are unique to this game's design and makes me question where things are going next for From Software and the future of soulslikes. I don't regret my experience with Elden Ring, my first or second playthrough. The first playthrough is one of the best gaming experiences I've ever had, but the second playthrough is where I started to ponder and started to see the cracks along the way, and now I'm hesitant to return to the experience. So let's get into it and explore my feelings of this game. I want to get the most important aspect of this game's design, and one that has made a shift in the overall structure of previous titles as well as just Souls-like games in general, and that is Elden Ring's open world. At one point I had an epiphany while playing Skyrim. What if you took Skyrim's open world and Dark Souls' combat system and put them together? Well, Elden Ring is quite literally that game. It is the fusion of both worlds and realizes an idea I entertained in my head at one point. Although it's not exactly how I envisioned it, but the dream to some extent has come true. At the same time, there is a semblance of disappointment to be felt too along the way though. Like someone believing they were in the afterlife when they get a heavenly breeze and discover a lush forest with a beautiful waterfall with crystal blue water, but then all of a sudden you get an irritating itch or a sense of pain only to realize there's a leech on your leg. Does any of that make sense? No? Doesn't matter because a lot of Elden Ring's world doesn't make that much sense either. Not without a plethora of lore videos or reading descriptions or getting cryptic dialogue from another chick with a depressed voice or another chick with 4 arms. It's like Dark Souls, but less fantasy and more high fantasy with some Game of Thrones added into it. On the one hand, it's jaw-droppingly beautiful. From a visual standpoint, Elden Ring is the best game they've done in terms of locational variety and color theory. Each area is always a treat, and the mindfucks only continue when you realize there's a whole underground network underneath the main map. From beginning to end, you are rewarded with eye candy with a world that feels so lifelike on the surface that it brings what was sorely lacking from Dark Souls 3, where a lot of the areas looked the same and the game just kind of had Bloodborne syndrome with its, overall color variety, or lack thereof actually. The scale of all of the places feel big and grandiose, the kind of thing you would see in an epic fantasy setting, and that's what Elden Ring's world is supposed to represent. An epic fantasy setting, a bigger and richer world with lots of secrets to uncover. With the assistance of George R. R. Martin, who's found another opportunity to not work on Winds of Winter, instead helps create a large and grand world for us to gallivant in and realize our horse-riding, dragon-slaying fantasy in Dark Souls fashion. The first time experience I had my ignoramus glasses on, ignoring the issues I would have seen in the next playthrough. I gorged through the secret areas, the dungeons, launched a crusade against all of the bosses the game could muster at me. I was exhausted as fuck towards the end, but I got more than my money's worth. On the second playthrough though, I got tired as fuck before I even reached the capital. The game has so much content that it can make your head spin, and has the most bosses out of any of their other games. But at the same time, going through every single nugget of content gets incredibly daunting, and the only motivating factor is the willingness to experiment with your character and see what kind of challenges and builds you can put yourself through. For general playthroughs, it gets less fun and more repetitive because of how much traveling you have to do. First few times you may not notice too much of the burnout, and you may still want to tackle all of the content for a challenge run or a build run, but with the volume of content that's present in this game, it ends up becoming a chore down the track, and you'll more than likely end up just scaling down your playthrough, where you only just fight all the important bosses and ignore the rest. I tackled everything the first time, but I did not want to do it again in the second playthrough. The open world is beautiful to look at. Every discovery is genuinely amazing the first time you see it, and the amount of detail they've put into the scenery is the best they've done so far. But once the novelty wears off, and once I've discovered a lot of the areas and obtained items of value, I had little to no reason returning to a lot of those areas in the game. They just end up becoming space that occupies the map without my presence. Open world gaming is something I could either really get into in the long term or get sick of after a playthrough or two. Games like Skyrim and Minecraft have great open worlds because they allow so much flexibility in how you interact with it, and those interactions often transcend combat. But experiences like, say, The Witcher 3, I was happy to go through it the first time around and do everything, but I can't really see myself doing all of that again. Elden Ring is like that too, to an extent, where the first playthrough you absorb everything, and then in the next couple of playthroughs you start to scale down things just to make the playthroughs more enjoyable and not get too bored. You have lots of vast empty space with not a lot of people that exist in the world that you can talk to, besides the ones that pretty much want to kill you. And the ones that do want to talk to you are even far and few between, and have more problems than you can solve. The world is beautiful, but static, like a world frozen in time. Because of that stupid fucking tree and the lore behind the game, people for some reason don't have the epiphany to formulate some semblance of rebuilding besides the ladders or the lifts that still work somehow. I was fine with the static status in Dark Souls because of the life-threatening circumstances that affected all of mankind. Same goes for Demon Souls. But what about in Elden Ring? What's stopping me from ignoring the Erd Tree and just, settling in somewhere else instead? Or what's exactly stopping some of the more sane people from just moving on with their lives? It's not like anyone's really going hollow or anything in this game. If the volume of the content was as consistent in terms of quality as a lot of the main game bosses, then I would be more eager to keep replaying anyways and tackle everything, but instead, I get a lot of copy and paste bosses I don't want to fight again after I fought them the first time. This, in effect, forces me to scale down my next playthrough to get more of the high points of the game's experience, to experience more of the reasons why I love Elden Ring. The reason I was fine doing everything again in the Dark Souls trilogy as well as Bloodborne and Sekiro was because the worlds in those games were more dense and compact in comparison to Elden Ring, making it easier to organically find and enjoy the content as well as tackling the smaller pool of bosses in comparison to Elden Ring's ginormous boss roster. Sometimes having more isn't always a good thing, and while I understand that the copy and pasting method is to just occupy space in the open world so that you would have stuff to do in the designated areas, I just don't care for it that much. I would much rather have a smaller world with more unique enemies and bosses than a big gigantic world with a few unique and interesting bosses, but a lot of copy and paste bosses. I tackle the bosses that I want to fight and ignored the copy versions of those bosses. Wanting to move on prematurely wanting to ignore content when there's a lot of it, it's not a good thing. It's a bad feeling, and Elden Ring is the first game in the From Software lineup to make me feel this way. Copy and paste bosses and reusing content is no secret. All of the other From Software games have done it to a degree, but Elden Ring is the worst game in this aspect, and it's in part to the overall size of the map. The DLC has the same issues too and doesn't really improve that problem. In fact, it makes it worse when you combine it with the base game. It's beautiful, and the Shadow Keep is one of my favorite places to traverse in the game due to its multi-layered design, but the more I progressed, the more I wanted it to be over, and it's a reflection of the main game too, and it doesn't improve in the DLC. My second playthrough was 2 years after my first one, and that was when the game first came out. I came back because of the DLC. I replayed the Souls games in Bloodborne and Sekiro multiple times in the course of those 2 years, but I only finished Elden Ring twice, this year marking my second playthrough. After I finished all of the areas and got the ending I wanted in the first playthrough, I was absolutely done with this game. I wanted to replay it, the thought was definitely still in my head, but the more I thought about what I would have to go through, the less I wanted to do it. A part of me still wants to revisit the game again at some point, but only under certain conditions. Or if I'm doing, say, a modded playthrough like with the Convergence mod, something that shakes things up and gives me reasons to return to said areas, or even like a randomizer run. The open world and the exploration is, like I said, amazing the first time around. Riding with Torrent and taking in the views is something I haven't felt since Skyrim in terms of open world immersion. And in my second playthrough, I still had some of those moments, but I also noticed how pointless open world combat becomes for the most part. Besides some of the open world bosses, a lot of the enemies don't give you much of a reason to fight them. Torrent gives you the mobility to ignore them entirely, and rarely are you forced into engaging with them. The annoying crabs in Leonia of the Lakes I avoided early because of how annoying they were, but I still avoided them late game because of how worthless they were. Why would I go out of my way to kill a large crab or a rune bear for fuck all rewards? This makes open world combat for the most part redundant, and you're only engaging with it for specific reasons and not necessarily because it's fun and engaging. And when you obtain items from areas, there's not much of a reason to return there again, and even more so in New Game Plus that doesn't really change anything besides increasing enemy health and more damage. I'm open to the idea of open world, but not on the scale that Elden Ring operates on. Playing Elden Ring again made me realize that I genuinely preferred the more linear but interconnected design of Dark Souls because it was just more digestible. There is, however, one other great thing about the open world, and when it comes to this aspect, Elden Ring is the best game when it comes to this point, and that is the open-ended sense of progression that the game has. Dark Souls 1 and 2, and to some extent 3, but not as much, allowed some flexibility in terms of where you could go first. But the avenues weren't as vast or as wide as it is in Elden Ring, because there are so many more places and more bosses to fight. You have way more opportunities than ever before to get stronger. The Tree Sentinel is one of the first bosses you come across and is a reminder that your character is weak as piss, but you're not obligated to fight it. In fact, you can avoid it entirely because of the open world, and the open world allows you to move on from the Tree Sentinel to engage in other fights instead, explore dungeons and get materials and items needed to make your character more powerful, and then you can return back to the Tree Sentinel and then just delete its health. Instead of being stuck in certain areas like in previous games, you have the choice to engage with other areas, and the same principle can be applied later in other areas. It's easy to end up in late game areas or areas where the monsters and bosses are much more powerful, but not once are you in a position where you're forced to beat a lot of those optional areas. The important areas you need to traverse and conquer can be managed with either enough power or skill. For a lot of the faults that can be found in the open world, the freedom that it gives players to tackle content at their own pace is invaluable, and is part of why this game was the most successful out of the bunch. While I'm somewhat mixed on the execution of Elden Ring's open world, I'm definitely sold on the combat. Dark Souls 3 had the best combat in the Dark Souls trilogy, and Elden Ring continues to refine that combat by finally adding a dedicated jump mechanic, being able to change weapon arts, as well as just feeling smoother overall. When you do a lot of the main hub area dungeons, as well as traversing smaller condensed areas packed with enemies, that's when I really start to enjoy the shit out of Elden Ring. Some of the bosses have amazing set pieces, and there are a metric ton of ways to engage with them, largely due to the best build variety we've seen since Dark Souls 2. There are so many different weapons and spells your character can utilize, and mods like the Convergence mod only expand that arsenal further. And even with the vanilla product, you still have lots of ways of going about things in one playthrough or another that it can make your head spin. The build variety would be one of the main reasons to replay Elden Ring, since build variety is such a crucial factor into what makes Souls games so replayable. Also, sneaking is another bonus. Doesn't always work and I don't always use it, but it does make for a good opportunity to backstab some enemies for a leg up if they're still alive. As for the boss content in general, well, a lot of the main bosses are great or at the very least visually stunning. Rykard may be another gimmick fight like the Storm King in Demon Souls or Yhorm the Giant in Dark Souls 3, but visually it's a fucking cool fight to engage with. Godfrey, Radahn, Placido Sax, Malekith, Messmer, Midra, Bale and Melina were my favourite bosses in the entire game. But when you open the game's world and see what else there is, it's a mixed bag in terms of quality, and it got to a point where I ended up ignoring optional bosses I already fought in a different area. The combat works best when it's in dense spaces and not as much in the open world, and it's because you're getting it more frequently, and this is where the combat can sustain itself. When something is too long, it then needs a gameplay loop to sustain it. Elden Ring's open world is where it falters because there's not much of a reason to engage in the combat besides engaging with the bosses in the open world, or to deal with invaders, or when entering certain areas, or going into small encampments or a church to get specific items. The combat is really fun and is dynamic in its build selection. The bosses are for the most part fun to fight once you finally learn them, as well as learning to create your own openings. But before that were Tekken combo levels of bullshit. Some of the bosses have combos you can only dream of in a Souls game. The kind of combos that games like Devil May Cry 5 have in a gigantic pool of movesets. Your character feels basic in comparison to what bosses can perform, and playing other games with different combat systems made me realize that Soulslikes need to find a way to incorporate the use of other mechanics like dynamic combos and movesets to make the combat more interesting, or at the very least take what Bloodborne and Sekiro did and expand it further. We're still stuck with a shitty one-at-a-time selection magic system that has been superseded by another game, Lords of the Fallen 2023, that lets players assign hotkeys for multiple magic spells at once, which makes magic-based combat more engaging and dynamic. While I don't really use magic, it's incredibly frustrating that From Software have still not implemented a key binding system for spell casting. They still have a fucking backwards system and it needs to change in the next project. To add more food for thought, why not have different stances for each weapon like in, say, Nioh? Each weapon in that game has a high, mid, and low stance that have different attack variations. High gives you slower but stronger attacks, low is the opposite, and mid is somewhere in between. And you also have a skill tree for weapon techniques as well. And changing between stances, as well as using magic or combos in between, is pretty seamless and is sometimes a lifesaver when you need to get a quick saving. I don't see any reason why From Software can't implement a similar mechanic in their next installment. I love Elden Ring's combat still, but I can see it having so much more potential, and playing some of those other games I just mentioned shows that the Souls-like formula needs to evolve more before it starts to become stale. Either add new mechanics and dynamics to the combat system or replace it with something else for future installments. Combat isn't all about rolling. The closest games in From Software's collection to make use of interesting combos or an interesting approach to the formula is in Sekiro and Bloodborne. Dark Souls and Elden Ring just weren't really able to realize it in the same way as those two, and yet I still find the game's combat to be really fun, and when you hit the high points of the game's content, it's even better. For me, it's like Dark Souls 3 on steroids, and I love it even in spite of there being room for more improvement. Thinking back on the combat in general, I still enjoy the strategic element towards understanding your enemy and the mechanics behind them. This in turn makes the game easier in the long run and still makes it fun once you've figured things out. Is the game hard? Yes and no. It's hard when you have a suboptimal build and you haven't worked on your stats much, but with a more optimal and broken build, the game is much easier. In fact, this is the easiest game of the bunch to get into because of the vast build variety that you do have. Even level 1 runners don't have anywhere near as rough of a time than they do in, say, level 4 Bloodborne or in Dark Souls 2 level 1. The amazing build variety that this game has allows many different players to enjoy their first time experience with a Souls-like game. The amount of fun and broken builds that can be had in this game allow for many players to, actually have fun. Elden Ring's combat at its peak, compounded with the build variety, is some of the most fun I've had in an action game or an RPG game. But it's not without some of its frustrations. There were pieces of content that were more frustrating than fun. Melina's waterfowl dance is still a bullshit move that takes more practice than practicing the entire game, and I don't blame people for using spirit summons still. Oh yeah, that's another thing. The game allows you to summon NPCs to assist you in battle, and like your gear, you can also upgrade the effectiveness of them. They're great for relieving a lot of pressure that the enemies in the game give you, but it's not exactly necessary, and in my second playthrough I decided to not use them at all this time. That was a personal choice though, and there's no right or wrong either. When it comes to difficulty in some of the boss fights, I feel like that now it's starting to make me ask questions about how far they're going to take it. This is especially true in the DLC. I don't mind difficult and challenging bosses, but if it gets to a point where it becomes more frustrating than fun, then that is a bad direction to take. Making bosses hard for the sake of it is never a good path to go towards in a challenging game. Whenever I play through the Souls games, there were a lot of fights I genuinely looked forward to, and I was genuinely pumped for the DLC content, except for the optional co-op dungeons in Dark Souls 2. They can eat shit. The content in those games were fun because they were still more on the challenging but fair side. But whenever I think of starting another playthrough of Elden Ring and knowing that the DLC exists, I get depressed knowing that bosses like Relana, Commander Gaius, and the final boss are there waiting for me, and they are fights that I just do not look forward to doing again. Set pieces in all of the fights are pretty amazing, especially in the DLC, and some of the game's bosses are definitely up there with the best bosses in Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne. But when I get the feeling of not wanting to fight certain bosses again, then that is a feeling I am concerned about, and it's not something I want to feel again in upcoming projects. Soulslikes aren't fun because they're hard. They're fun because of the open-ended approach to combat using different builds, as well as the puzzle element behind understanding enemy mechanics. If these games are going to become more difficult in the future, then that is all the more reason to evolve the formula further to support higher levels of difficulty. The reason Elden Ring is both the hardest and easiest game of the bunch is because it is much more build dependent. Depriving yourself of magic and other more powerful builds, as well as other mechanics like say blocking or parrying, makes the game much harder, and you start to see the cracks in the enemies more frequently. But if you use magic that's always been broken, as well as other broken builds or other mechanics that can trivialize certain bosses, then you have a much easier game on your hands. It took me a number of tries to beat the DLC final boss of the game with what I had. While I didn't have the most broken build, the bleed build-up made a big difference when I needed more of his health gone. Were there other builds I could have used instead? Of course. And those builds would have enabled me to bypass some of the more annoying mechanics and bullshit moves. You don't want to dodge Radahn all the time? That's fine, just use a big shield and a spear and block all of his attacks. Want to delete Moog quickly? Use Comet Azure and combo it with other buffs and watch his health disappear before he can do anything. The build variety is great, but it'll become an issue when the bosses are tuned to such a frustrating degree that I resort to broken builds just to get it out of the way. Bosses should still be challenging but fair, and still allow for a variety of different builds, whether they're easy or harder, to still have a fun and engaging experience. I got that experience with some of the bosses in the DLC, but there were some bosses that just made me not want to fight them ever again afterwards. Previous Souls bosses were enjoyable regardless of your builds because they were tuned enough to still be fun and challenging. But Elden Ring is showing possible signs of overtuning content more to keep up the reputation of keeping From Software games hard, which has never been the point of these games to begin with. Dark Souls was never a hard game to begin with. It was only perceived as hard back then because of its uniqueness at the time and how people didn't know what they were doing at first. Now that people have become acquainted with the formula long enough, Elden Ring is just more Souls, but in a open world space. As for the case of PvP, I don't really have anything to say about it since I've never touched it. Not once, and honestly, I'm never really been super fussed with PvP in the Souls games anyways. But I will recommend a channel that covers more of the PvP aspects of Elden Ring quite well. I'll put a link to the channel in the description. But to summarize the combat real quick, it's a lot of fun. Build variety is the best since Dark Souls 2. Bosses are really punishing, with great designs, with some being really satisfying to beat for the most part. As for horse combat, it fucking sucks, I hate it, and the DLC only solidified that hatred of it with bosses like Commander Gaius. But there is definitely more room for improvement, and the fact that I can identify what other games do better in the Souls-like genre shows that there is always room for new mechanics and dynamics to be added to the combat system of From Software's formula. And that's all I have to say for now with Elden Ring. It's a game that I absolutely love and at the same time share some disappointments with. Its open world and exploration is the best I've had since Dark Souls 1 on a first playthrough. Every area from a visual surface feels like a reward for taking the extra mile to travel further. Combat is awesome and the build variety even more so. Some fantastic boss fights and arenas, music is as awesome as it's always been since Dark Souls 1, and provides the most flexibility for newcomers to soulslikes. There are other things I haven't talked about like the story and the lore. To be honest, I don't give a fuck about Elden Ring's story. I don't care about being Elden Lord and never felt like it was something I had to do in the first place. It's not like how in Demon Souls or in Dark Souls you had a genuinely life-threatening reason to carry on to avoid a fate worse than death. In Elden Ring though, what's stopping me from just ignoring my duty and just chill with the merchants instead, or just sit in front of the ocean and dream about Bloodborne 2? The lore side of things is good and quite extensive, and the game has a number of great characters with interesting backstories. I found that to be more interesting than rolling and dying for a stupid fucking tree for some Game of Thrones bullshit to rule over a land so static that no one else has tried to repair the Elden Ring themselves. The greater will? Never had I a greater will to not give a fuck to begin with. 2 fingers, I'll give you 1. I think the reason why most people actually went for the Age of Stars ending is because they wanted to be with someone with 4 arms for some reason. To be honest though, I don't blame them. I got the ending as well, and what comes next is probably more interesting than the fucking story of this game anyways. I'm no lore expert, but I will say that this game definitely gives you a lot to unpack when you factor in how much content there is to begin with and how huge the world is. People that are lore fiends will get more than their money's worth. But for the story itself, I think Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Sekiro had far better stories in my opinion, which made me appreciate the lore a lot more, whereas in Elden Ring, I haven't really dived into it that much because I don't really care that much for the story at all. And one more thing to say before I move on, lore is not a replacement for story at all. Never has been, never will be. The questing system hasn't really changed, you still need guides to find everything, especially now in the open world with how easy it is to get lost, and not to mention how you can easily miss out on content without realizing it was there to begin with. I absolutely love Elden Ring, and while I've had some negative things to say about it, it comes more from the desire of wanting the game to be better than it is. Some of my favorite games have plenty of holes themselves, and Elden Ring is no different. I still think Elden Ring is the best game they've made since Bloodborne because the experiences offered the highest peaks of enjoyment I've had since then. But man, does it get tiring after a while exploring the open world and knowing where everything is. Some bosses I get compelled to ignore just because I don't want to fight them ever again. And using broken builds to ignore mechanics wouldn't fix anything, and it wouldn't make them any more fun. It would just make me want to move on quicker. Will I be doing challenge runs with Elden Ring in the future? I'm open to the idea. Will I be doing modded playthroughs? Of course. But will I be doing another general playthrough of vanilla Elden Ring again? Fuck no. Elden Ring is an amazing game, and I always think it will be, but it could have been so much better.